At my daughter's lavish birthday party in front of 150 wealthy guests, she suddenly slapped me so hard the entire room fell silent. My hand-carved gift box slipped from my fingers and shattered across the marble floor, but she didn't even look at it. Instead, she called me trash. My son-in-law calmly threw a glass of red wine onto my chest, and security dragged me out of the mansion I once sacrificed everything to help them build. As the heavy doors slammed behind me and the rain poured down, I realized something chilling. The people celebrating inside had no idea whose life had truly paid for their luxury. I was 70 years old, completely broke, and standing alone in a room filled with people whose fortunes existed because of my sacrifice. Not one of them knew it. To them, I was nothing more than a worn-out old man in a cheap suit who had spoiled a perfect evening. The security guards didn't hesitate. Their hands locked around my arms and hauled me across the marble floor. My worn shoes scraped against the polished stone, the same marble my money had helped pay for. Before another word could leave my mouth, they shoved me through the massive oak doors. I stumbled down the wide stone steps and hit the driveway hard. My knees cracked against the pavement, pain jolting up my legs as gravel cut into my skin. Behind me, those enormous doors swung shut with a deep, heavy boom, sealing away the warmth, the music, and the laughter within. Outside, the night air bit with a cold that felt brutal for Houston. Within seconds, the rain came heavy drops, hammering the driveway like tiny fists. The dark red wine soaking my shirt began bleeding down through the fabric of my jacket, thinned by rainwater, until it ran the color of old blood. For a long moment, I didn't move. I sat on the wet asphalt shaking, staring up at those bright windows of the estate. Through the glowing glass, I could make out shadows drifting, people laughing, lifting their glasses, celebrating beneath chandeliers and soft music, celebrating the life I had built for them. My hands trembled as the rain soaked through every layer and turned my bones to ice. I truly believed that was where my story ended. I thought it was finished. I thought I might die of a cold in the driveway of the very house I secretly owned. Slowly, painfully, I pressed myself up off the ground. Every joint protested as I rose to my feet. Rain plastered my gray hair flat against my forehead and streamed down my face like tears. I turned my back on the estate and started down the long, winding driveway toward the main gate. Behind me, the $15 million property blazed like a palace, yet it might as well have belonged to another universe. The cold wind drove straight through my soaked jacket. I had nowhere to go, not a dollar in my pockets, no family left to reach for. Every step weighed heavier than the one before. I moved down that dark road with rain blurring my sight and breath rising in slow clouds in the freezing air. Minutes passed, maybe longer. In the darkness, it felt like hours. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories, where we sit together and walk through the kind of tale that stays with you long after it ends. If stories like this one speak to something deep in you, I'd be glad if you stayed with me by subscribing and leaving as like it truly means a great deal. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. When someone close to you wrongs you, do you believe in confronting them face to face? Or do you think patience and quiet preparation are the wiser path? Drop your answer in the comments. And one more thing before we begin, some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of storytelling and dramatization. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of the story. The only sound was rain striking the pavement and the distant hum of the city far below the hills. Then the darkness shattered with light. A pair of blinding headlights sliced through the storm behind me. I heard the deep, powerful growl of an engine, low, expensive, unmistakably commanding. Tires screamed on the wet asphalt as a long, midnight black Rolls-Royce Ghost surged forward and swerved sideways, cutting off the road ahead of me. My heart slammed against my ribs. For a split second, I was certain Rowan had sent someone to finish the humiliation, to haul me somewhere even darker. The heavy rear door of the Rolls-Royce swung open slowly. A man stepped out into the pouring rain. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit that likely cost more than everything I had ever owned combined. In one hand, he carried a large black umbrella, holding the storm at bay. He looked to be in his late 40s, tall, composed, his sharp eyes cold and calculating as they moved over me through the downpour. I had never laid eyes on him before. He's walked closer to the umbrella, throwing a shadow across his face. His gaze traveled from my soaked clothes to the wine stains on my chest, then down to my trembling hands. He stopped a few feet away. "Get in the car, Mr. Whitmore," he said evenly. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that left no room for argument. It's time we crush them. I stood there frozen in the freezing rain, those words ringing in my ears. Crush them. The phrase hung in the wet air, pushing back against the roar of the storm. Barely 10 minutes earlier, my own daughter had slapped me across the face and called me trash in front of the wealthiest people in the city. My son-in-law had hurled wine onto my chest and ordered security to throw me out like garbage. And now, a stranger in a Rolls-Royce was dangling something I couldn't yet name. For a moment, my exhausted mind refused to process what was happening. I felt empty, broken, ready to accept whatever miserable fate waited for me, somewhere on the dark streets of River Oaks. And now, this stranger, a man who moved with the calm authority of immense wealth and power, stood before me offering something I hadn't anticipated, a way to fight back. I hesitated. Every instinct built over 70 hard years of living told me to be careful. Men like this didn't simply materialize out of the rain to rescue broken strangers, and you certainly didn't climb into a midnight black Rolls-Royce with someone you'd never met. Not in a place like River Oaks, where fortunes were assembled in daylight and buried secrets flourished in the dark. I studied his face. His jaw was tight controlled. His dark eyes held no trace of sympathy or pity, only cold, precise calculation. And strangely, that was exactly what persuaded me. I had lived with pity long enough. For 5 humiliating years, I had swallowed every drop of it while living in Rowan's damp basement. I had endured the quiet looks, the dismissive sighs, the polite murmurings about how unfortunate my situation was. I was done with pity. I wanted justice. Or perhaps, standing in that bleak rain, what I truly wanted was revenge. Without a word, I stepped toward the car. The stranger pulled the heavy door open wider and angled the umbrella so the rain wouldn't reach my head. I lowered myself into the back seat. The contrast was staggering. The interior carried the scent of polished mahogany and hand-stitched leather. Warm air folded around me instantly, driving out the deep chill that had settled into my bones. For a moment, I just sat there undone by the comfort. The instant my soaked legs were fully inside, the man pulled the door shut with a solid, reassuring thud. The storm's fury outside disappeared at once. Inside the cabin, the silence was total, thick, and insulated, like stepping into a bank vault. A moment later, the stranger settled in from the opposite side, folding his umbrella with unhurried precision. Beyond a dark pane of tinted glass, the driver smoothly engaged the gears. The Rolls-Royce began to move. Through the rear window, I watched the blazing lights of the $15 million estate dissolve into the rain. My daughter's estate, or perhaps, as I was about to discover, not entirely hers. I sat awkwardly in the immaculate seat, painfully conscious of my appearance. My cheap suit was drenched with rain and smeared with red wine, the fabric pressed against the luxurious cream leather beneath me. I felt like a stain left inside a museum. The stranger showed no sign of concern. He reached forward and opened a concealed compartment in the polished wooden console between us. From it, he drew a thick heated towel and passed it to me. Then he measured out a pour of amber liquid from a cut-glass decanter into a heavy tumbler. "Drink," he said simply. "It will stop the shaking." My hands trembled slightly as I took the towel. I worked the rain and wine from my face, feeling warmth seep back into my skin. Then I accepted the glass. I took a careful sip. The scotch burned a clean path down my throat, spreading heat through my chest like a small, controlled fire. For the first time since the slap, I could draw a full breath. I pulled in a slow lungful and finally found my voice. "Who are you?" I asked quietly. My voice sounded hoarse and fragile even to my own ears. "And why would someone like you stop for a worthless old man on the side of the road?" The man adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate jacket. Silver cufflinks caught the warm cabin light. Then he looked directly at me, his gaze steady and unsettlingly calm. "My name is Elliot Voss," he said. "And you are far from worthless, Gerald. In fact, at this moment, you may be the most important man in Houston. You simply don't realize it yet." I stared at him, thrown completely off balance. He knew my name, my full name. A sharp current of anxiety moved through me. Was he a police officer, a private investigator, or worse, one of Rowan's corporate enemies, looking to use me as leverage? "How do you know who I am?" I asked, sitting a fraction straighter. It was my first instinctive reach for some shred of dignity. "I've never seen you before in my life. I'm a retired mechanic from Cleveland. No money, no power. My own daughter threw me out of her house tonight." I paused and took another small sip of the scotch. If this is some kind of ransom scheme, I went on bitterly, you have the wrong man. They wouldn't pay $1 to get me back. Elliot permitted himself a faint smile. There was no warmth in it. He settled back comfortably and folded his hands in his lap. I know exactly what happened inside that house tonight, Gerald, he said. I know about the wooden box you carved. I know about the slap your daughter gave you. I know Rowan threw wine on your jacket. And I know security dragged you out the front door like an unwanted stray. My stomach nodded. This man knew far too much. I've been watching your son-in-law for a long time. A chill moved down my spine, and this one had nothing to do with the rain. Elliot spoke with a quiet certainty possessed only by men who controlled powerful information. You've been watching Rowan, I said slowly. Why, I hesitated. Are you a cop? Elliot's smile returned colder this time, far less friendly. He reached toward the console and lifted a silver tablet resting beside the decanter. Open this. He placed the device in my hands. My hands still trembled slightly as I took it. The screen was already lit. Row upon row of financial records filled the display. Bank transfers, corporate filings, legal documents, spreadsheets dense with figures. My eyes moved across it helplessly. None of it meant anything to me. I don't understand any of this, I admitted quietly. I'm a mechanic. I fix engines. I don't read corporate balance sheets. Elliot leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze sharpening like a surgeon zeroing in on a patient. I am the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, he said evenly, a private equity firm based in Chicago. Our specialty is aggressive acquisitions. We buy companies, break them apart, liquidate their assets, and expose the debts their owners work to conceal. He paused for a beat. In plain terms, Gerald, we destroy corporations built on lies. My grip tightened on the tablet. Elliot's voice held steady. And your son-in-law's empire, he continued, is one of the most fascinating lies we've come across in years. I swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of the weight of that expensive scotch sitting in my stomach. Why would a Wall Street billionaire concern himself with a retired mechanic from Cleveland? I asked, completely at a loss. Elliot didn't answer right away. He watched the rain tracing lines down the dark window for a moment, then turned back to face me. Because of what's inside that tablet, Gerald, he said quietly. 5 years ago, Rowan Halcott was a desperate man. His first 2 startups had collapsed. Investors had abandoned him. He was buried under debt and staring down the barrel of personal bankruptcy. More than anything, he was terrified that your daughter would walk the moment the money dried up. The words struck a nerve so deep, I instinctively shut my eyes. Memories surged back with painful clarity. Elliot was right. I could still see that night in Cleveland as vividly as if it had happened last week. A bitter evening in late November. Rowan had shown up unannounced at my modest house, not much to look at, just a small place with peeling paint and a garage bolted to the side. But it had been mine for decades. He sat down at my old kitchen table, the one scored with scratches from years of tools and repair manuals. Then he buried his face in his hands and wept. Not politely, not softly. He wept like a man who had been driven to the very end of his rope. He told me everything had fallen apart. His companies were gone. His credit was in ruins. Investors had fled. He said if he couldn't find capital, immediately his career was finished. I just need one last chance, he had said between sobs. One more round of funding, and this real estate tech platform will take off. I know it will. But there was a condition. He begged me to keep it from Diane. His voice was thick with shame when he laid it out. His pride, he said, couldn't bear the thought of his wife learning that her working-class father had bailed him out. Diane believed he was a brilliant self-made entrepreneur, and he had to protect that image. If she finds out you rescued me, he said, she'll never see me the same way again. And I, like a fool blinded by love, had agreed. I loved my daughter more than anything this world had ever given me. I wanted her marriage to hold together. I wanted her to be happy. So I did what fathers do. I sacrificed everything. I went to the bank and drained my retirement account. I sold the auto repair shop I had spent 40 years building from nothing. That garage had been my life's entire work. Every tool, every loyal customer, every memory gone. When the dust settled, I had exactly $500,000. Every cent I possessed in the world. I handed it over to him, but because Rowan insisted the money stay hidden from Diane, his lawyer set up a blind trust. The funds were moved into a corporate shell designed to keep my name completely off the official paperwork. I signed without a moment's hesitation. I wasn't making an investment. I was saving my daughter's marriage. And in doing so, I gave away everything to protect Rowan's fragile ego. Elliot studied my face carefully as the memories resurfaced. His eyes tracked every flicker of regret and sorrow moving across my expression. "You placed your entire life into a blind trust," he said evenly. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. You surrendered your home, your retirement, and every shred of financial security just to shield the pride of the man who threw you out into the rain tonight. I dropped my gaze. "Yes," I said softly. My voice cracked under the weight of old shame. I believed I was helping my family. I stared down at my worn shoes resting on the spotless floor mat. But it didn't turn out that way. My throat tightened as I repeated the version of events I had been fed over and over for 5 years. Not long after the trust was set up, the market turned bad. I said it slowly. Rowan came to me months later, looking utterly devastated. He said the startup market had collapsed. He said every dollar he had put in with my money had evaporated overnight. I swallowed hard. He told me the entire $500,000 was gone. The words still tasted bitter. Lost. I took an unsteady breath. He said he felt terrible about it. I went on quietly, but he claimed another group of investors had stepped in at the 11th hour to save the company. My money was gone, but at least the business had survived. I paused. That's how I ended up living in their basement. The confession settled heavily inside the car. Rowan said I could stay there out of the goodness of his heart. I continued. He said he felt responsible for where I'd ended up. I had no house left, no business, no retirement. I laughed a hollow sound. So he gave me a narrow room beside the water heater, and I accepted it because I believed him. I believed I had destroyed my own future with my own hands. I thought he was doing me a favor, I whispered, letting a foolish old man stay under his roof. Silence filled the Rolls-Royce. The engine murmured beneath us as rain tapped steadily against the windows. Elliot showed no trace of sympathy. Instead, something colder settled into his expression. He leaned forward and pressed the tablet screen in my hands. A new document loaded instantly, a detailed bank statement from exactly 5 years ago. The numbers glowed on the screen. For a moment, I couldn't draw breath. The figures told an entirely different story from the one I had lived inside for half a decade. My heart began hammering violently against my chest. A crushing wave of disbelief crashed over me as I stared at the data. "He didn't lose a single dollar, Gerald," Elliot said quietly. His voice cut through the silence of the cabin like a blade. "He lied to you." The words rang in my skull. A lie. It couldn't be. It simply could not be. I had seen the documents. I had watched Rowan pacing in my basement, tearing at his hair as he described the market's collapse. I had watched him weep real tears while apologizing over and over again. For 5 years, I had believed I was the one who had destroyed my own retirement, that I had wagered my future and lost everything. My throat tightened as my grip on the tablet tightened with it. My knuckles went white. Elliot reached across and gently lifted the device from my shaking hands. Then he set something heavier in their place, a thick manila folder. "Open it," he said. His tone left no room for argument. I slowly lifted the cover. Inside were dozens of printed documents, each stamped with official bank seals and federal registry markings. This was not speculation. This was evidence. My eyes moved rapidly across the first page. It was a financial ledger from the exact month I had wired the $500,000. According to Rowan's story, that money had been sunk into a startup that crumbled within weeks. But what the document in front of me showed was something else entirely, a wire transfer running directly from the blind trust straight into a freshly formed corporate holding account. The money hadn't been lost. It had been preserved, carefully, deliberately. Rowan had used my life savings as the founding capital for his real estate technology company. My hands trembled as I turned the page and the next and the next. Each document laid out the explosive growth of the company across the past 5 years. No other early investors, no miracle venture capitalists sweeping in to rescue the business. Just one source of capital, mine. Every office, every server, every luxury car, every mansion raised from my $500,000. The realization hit me like a freight train at full speed. Rowan hadn't let me stay in his basement out of kindness. He kept me there because it was the safest place to keep me controlled. He needed me isolated, destitute, ashamed, and ignorant. If I had remained in Cleveland, I might have started asking questions. But by pulling me under his roof, stripping away my dignity, and feeding me a constant diet of reminders about my supposed failure, he made certain I would never go looking for the truth. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. For 5 years I had eaten his leftovers. I wore the same fading clothes until the fabric nearly fell apart. I had apologized to him for occupying space in his home. All while he flew on private jets, poured rare vintage wine, and bought Diane $15 million estates with my money. Something deep inside me shifted. A quiet anger climbed slowly from somewhere in my chest. It wasn't explosive. It was colder than that, sharper, a controlled fury that burned away every last trace of grief. For the first time in years, my mind felt clear. I raised my head and looked directly at Elliot. My eyes were steady now. "So he stole it," I said slowly. My voice came out calm, far calmer than I felt, and strangely foreign to my own ears. "He took my money, built an empire on top of it, and then erased me from the picture entirely." Elliot shook his head. A faint predatory smile edged onto his mouth, the kind a hunter wears when he knows the trap is already closed. "That," Elliot said smoothly, "is actually the most beautiful part of this entire situation." Gerald and I frowned confused. "Rowan Halcott is an extraordinarily arrogant man," Elliot continued. "But arrogance and intelligence are not the same thing. When he persuaded you to set up that blind trust 5 years ago, he made a critical error. He tried to save money." Elliot leaned forward slightly, a note of quiet amusement in his voice. "Instead of engaging a top-tier legal firm to draft a custom trust agreement, he used a standard off-the-shelf legal template, something cheap, generic, and widely available. He thought he was being clever. In reality, he had simply exposed his own ignorance." Elliot tapped a finger lightly against the folder resting in my lap. "Rowan," he explained, "was so consumed with keeping your involvement concealed from Diane that he failed to understand how the trust structure actually worked." Elliot paused before pressing on. "He had appointed himself managing director of the trust. That gave him full operational control over the funds he could move, invest them, build companies with them, do whatever he pleased." Elliot's smile sharpened. "But operational control is not the same thing as ownership." He reached across the console and flipped the dossier open to its final page. His finger came to rest on a dense paragraph buried near the bottom of the document. "Read this clause," he said. I leaned in, straining to make sense of the legal language printed on the page. The text was dense with complex terminology, the kind of writing made for lawyers, not mechanics. Elliot spoke again, calmly translating it. "When the trust was established, you were named as the sole primary equity holder. That means the original investment, your $500,000, belonged entirely to you. Rowan was never granted ownership, only management." Elliot tapped the paragraph again. "And since that $500,000 was the only capital used to incorporate the holding company that later became Rowan's empire, your equity stake carried forward into every corporate structure that followed." My mind labored to keep pace. Elliot's voice stayed measured. "In plain terms," he said, "your ownership percentage grew in step with the company itself. As the business expanded, so did your equity." He settled back into the Rolls-Royce's leather seat. "You were never bought out. Rowan never had the personal capital required to purchase your shares, which means that legally speaking," Elliot let the sentence hang for a moment, "you still hold the majority." I looked at him blankly. The words echoed through my mind, but refused to fully land. "I'm not sure I follow what you're telling me," I murmured, though somewhere deep inside something powerful was beginning to take shape, something impossible and terrifying all at once. "What does that actually mean for me?" Elliot turned his head slightly and gestured toward the rain-streaked window. Through the glass, the distant glow of the River Oaks estate we had just left was still visible, its lights shimmering through the storm like a palace suspended above the darkness. Elliot pointed toward it. "It means," he said quietly, "that legally speaking, Mr. Whitmore, you own 80% of everything." The breath left my body. The company, the corporate accounts, the investment portfolios. His finger shifted slightly, still aimed at the distant mansion. "And that house, the same one they just threw you out of." The word struck my mind like a hammer blow. 80%. I owned 80% of a multi-million-dollar empire. For several seconds I couldn't speak. My thoughts scrambled to make sense of what had just been placed in front of me. The damp basement room where I had slept. The cheap clothes on my back. The leftovers I ate alone, while the rest of the house entertained upstairs. All of it had been a lie. Rowan wasn't my benefactor. I was his, and he had repaid that sacrifice by turning me into a ghost inside my own investment. I looked down at the thick folder in my lap. The weight of it felt enormous now. Slowly I began turning the pages. Elliot had flagged dozens of documents, corporate structures, tax filings, financial transfers. Each one traced the growth of Rowan's company, step by step. My money had been the foundation. Every office building, every development project, every luxury purchase, all of it raised from that initial $500,000. A deep tide of betrayal moved through me. I kept turning the pages. Then something near the back of the folder stopped me cold. A single sheet of paper that looked nothing like the others. Unlike the financial reports and legal filings, this document was short and plain. Too plain. I pulled it carefully from the stack. The paper was crisp, official, a legal waiver. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it toward the warm cabin light and began to read. Each sentence pulled the knot in my chest tighter. It was a complete equity waiver, an unconditional transfer of ownership. The document stated that the primary shareholder, ME, voluntarily surrendered all equity rights in the trust and transferred them directly to Rowan Halcott, all 80%. My breathing slowed. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the page. There it was. My signature. Clear, undeniable, not forged, not fabricated. My handwriting, my pen, my consent. The air inside the Rolls-Royce suddenly felt thin. For several seconds I couldn't move. I simply stared at the page while my heart hammered in my chest. When had I signed this? The question repeated itself over and over. I searched my memory frantically, every meeting, every document, every signature. Then the memory hit me like a fist to the ribs. My breath caught sharply as the realization detonated inside my mind. About a month earlier, Rowan had come down to the basement, carrying a thick stack of paperwork under his arm. I can see the moment now, with painful clarity, every detail snapping back into focus. That day he had been unusually warm. He even brought me a hot cup of coffee, something he almost never did. His voice carried that casual, faintly impatient tone people use when dealing with bureaucratic tedium. He told me the company's health insurance provider needed updated medical history forms for everyone listed as a dependent on his property. The insurer was conducting routine compliance checks and required signatures from anyone living under his roof. "It's just pointless paperwork," he had muttered, rolling his eyes. "Insurance companies love wasting everyone's time." He moved through the documents, quickly tapping the bottom of each page with his finger and showing me exactly where to sign. I didn't question it. Why would I? Rowan had been managing all the financial affairs of the household for years. To me, he was the successful businessman, the man who had generously allowed me to stay in his home after my own foolish investment had wiped out my retirement. I trusted him. I didn't bother to read the fine print. My eyesight had been deteriorating, and the text on those forms was small and dense. It seemed far simpler to do what he asked. So I signed page after page after page, all the while believing I was helping my son-in-law satisfy some routine insurance requirement. Now, sitting inside the hushed luxury of the Rolls-Royce, the truth was plain. Rowan had slipped the equity waiver into the middle of those medical forms. He had buried it there, deliberately tucked between innocuous documents where I would never think to question it. He had used my trust as a weapon. He knew my eyesight was failing. He knew insurance paperwork would never raise my suspicion. And he knew that after 5 years beneath his roof, I would never dream he was capable of something so calculated and cold. The sheer depth of malice behind that deception made my stomach turn. Rowan didn't merely want me hidden in the basement. He wanted the empire unknowingly built on my money, and he had planned to steal it legally, using my own signature, my own pen. I stared at the dark ink scrolled across the bottom of the waiver. My name, my handwriting, my consent. A wave of humiliation rolled through me, heavy and suffocating. For weeks, Rowan had smiled at me across the kitchen table. For weeks he had tossed sarcastic remarks in my direction, laughing quietly when I apologized for taking up space in his house. All the while knowing the paperwork, transferring everything to him, was already signed and waiting. He had been patient, biding his time, for the moment the clock would run out. I ran my thumb along the edge of the crisp page, bitterness rising in the back of my throat. Across from me, Elliot watched in silence. His dark eyes tracked every shift in my expression. He offered no sympathy, no comfort. And strangely, I was grateful for that. Comfort was worthless now. What I needed was clarity. I lowered my gaze and studied the document again. My eyes stopped at the date printed near my signature. A cold chill moved through me. The document had been signed 4 weeks ago, but the effective transfer date, the moment ownership would legally change hands, was printed clearly at the top of the page. Midnight tonight. My eyes went wide. Everything clicked into place at once. The lavish birthday party inside the River Oaks estate wasn't simply a celebration for Diane. It was a victory lap. Rowan had assembled the city's wealthiest investors, developers, and social elites under one roof because he knew something they didn't. By tomorrow morning, he intended to officially own everything: the company, the assets, the mansion, all of it. Throwing me out tonight had been the final move. He no longer needed to keep up appearances. He already had my signature. From where he stood, the game was finished. He wanted me gone before midnight, gone before the legal transfer became permanent and beyond reach. Had I simply kept walking that night, stumbled down the road, checked into whatever dim motel would take a soaked old man, and tried to drown out the memory of my own daughter calling me garbage, then come morning, it would all be finished. Rowan would have everything. The empire raised on my bones would be his to keep, and I'd spend whatever years I had left as a forgotten old mechanic who gave away his entire life because he couldn't stop loving people who didn't deserve it. I raised my head slowly. Elliot's eyes found mine, cold, unblinking. Something broke loose inside me. At that instant, some long-lodged weight I'd been hauling around for years. The grief dissolved. What replaced it was harder, resolve, lean and burning. I pulled a breath deep into my lungs, wrapped both hands around the document, and held it tight. Blind loyalty had cost me everything it was going to cost me. The fury rising in my chest didn't scatter my thoughts. It gathered them. My mind felt sharper than it had in years, edges I'd almost forgotten I possessed. I slid the waiver back into the folder and closed it. Then I raised my eyes to Elliot's face. "I know what he did," I said. My voice came out quiet and level. "He robbed me blind. He raised an empire on my back." I let a beat pass. "But that still doesn't account for you." I shifted slightly in the seat. "Men with cars like this one don't go fishing for drenched old mechanics in the middle of a storm out of goodwill." I held his gaze. "So tell me, what do you actually want?" A small nod from Elliot. Measured, almost like a teacher whose student had finally asked the right question. "Your family's grievances are of no interest to us, Gerald," he said, flat, clinical. "What interests us is the money." He settled his arm along the console. 6 months ago, Vanguard Holdings flagged Rowan Halcott's operation as a candidate for acquisition. He went on, his tone unhurried. The surface looked pristine, strong margins, fast growth, a balance sheet so clean it practically gleamed. The corner of Elliot's mouth lifted. "We were ready to write him a very comfortable check." A brief pause. "But we don't move a dollar before we've looked under every stone ourselves." He pressed 2 fingers against the folder. "Our forensic accountants go through everything, every ledger, every filed return, every offshore structure attached to the business. Finding what people want buried is what they do." Elliot tilted the cut glass decanter and added a measure of scotch to his tumbler. The liquid turned slowly in the light. "Rowan Halcott can sell," Elliot said. "I'll grant him that, but running a business—" He raised the glass. "He has no idea what he's doing." He sipped. "And at a card table, he's a disaster." A pause, then he tapped the folder a 3rd time. "Our people found a wound inside his finances, deep, serious." He looked straight at me. "Your son-in-law has been bleeding the company dry, not to grow it, not to protect it. He's been feeding it into illegal high-stakes poker games, underground tables." Elliot shook his head. He was convinced he'd win his way out. He leaned in toward me. He dug his own grave instead. My throat closed. "How bad?" I asked. He answered without blinking. $10 million. It landed like a boot to the chest. $10 million. My mind couldn't get its arms around it. "All of that?" My voice came out thin. "Who holds the debt? The banks?" Elliot brought the glass to his mouth, drank slowly, set it down. "If banks were involved, he'd file for bankruptcy tomorrow, rearrange what's left, and be back on his feet within a year." He said, not harsh, just factual. "That's not the world he's in, Gerald. The $10 million Rowan Halcott owes does not appear on any legitimate institution's ledger anywhere." He let that breathe. He owes it to a Russian syndicate. They run their operations out of Las Vegas. The words sat in the sealed cabin like something toxic released into still air. These aren't people who send a strongly worded letter when a payment goes missing. Elliot said, his voice dropping a register. They are methodical. They are brutal. Their version of a collection notice doesn't involve attorneys. He paused. It involves broken bones, properties reduced to ash, people who go out for an errand and are never seen again. Ice moved through me. The picture I'd carried of Rowan, lord of his estate, untouchable, moving through his own rooms like royalty, crumbled. He was no king. He was a man with a noose already around his neck. Elliot kept going steady as ever. His final deadline with the syndicate expired this morning. They've shown patience most people in his position never receive. That patience is gone now. They want what they're owed. His gaze flattened. And the method is his problem, not theirs. Something cold and heavy dropped into the center of my chest. For just a flicker, the briefest instant, something almost like pity moved through me when I thought of Rowan. Almost. But if the man owes $10 million to people like that, I said, working through it out loud, then what is funding that spectacle going on back at the estate right now? I motioned toward the hills, where the glow of the property was still faintly visible through the rain. That kind of event doesn't come cheap. The food, the champagne, a full security detail, the entertainment. None of it tracks for a man on the edge of being hunted. Elliot's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes did a faint recognition, like a tutor watching a slow student suddenly grasp the theorem. "You're starting to see it," he said quietly. He brought his elbows to his knees and leaned forward. "That gathering tonight is not a birthday party. Flat. Definitive. It is a fabrication, a very costly, very carefully constructed one." He angled his head toward the distant light. Rowan assembled a room full of the wealthiest technology investors in the state, venture capitalists, private equity principals, founders sitting on enormous pools of capital. Every last one of them walked in, believing it was a social occasion. He paused. The actual agenda is something else entirely. My gut twisted. "He's selling them something," I said. Elliot dipped his chin. "A large equity stake in his company pitched at a price that looks like a bargain they'd be fools to pass up." My pulse kicked higher. Elliot's expression didn't warm. The financials he's handing around the room tonight show spectacular returns and breakneck growth. He stopped. "Every figure on those pages is a lie, manufactured. Our accountants verified it line by line. The real numbers, the $10 million crater sitting at the center of his business, have been scrubbed from every document in that room." My stomach dropped further. "So he collects the money tonight," I said. Elliot nodded once. "Gathers the capital, then wires it directly to the people who would otherwise be paying him a very different kind of visit." I felt nauseous. "And the investors?" Elliot was unmoved. "They wake up to find themselves holding shares in a company buried under a debt they were never shown." He settled back. "They carry the wreckage." He walks away breathing. The sheer scope of it pressed on me like something physical. Rowan wasn't only betraying me, he was orchestrating the simultaneous robbery of an entire room of people using their own greed as the instrument, all to buy himself one more day of survival. Elliot folded his hands. "My firm has genuine interest in the technology Rowan built. The software has real merit. It has a future." A short pause. "But Vanguard Holdings will not touch any asset that has organized crime threaded through its foundation." His eyes sharpened to a point. "The only path to acquiring what we want runs through the total collapse of the existing structure, and that requires Rowan Halcott's removal." The word dropped into the silence between us. Removal. Elliot slid a hand inside his jacket and withdrew a device unlike anything I'd seen carried as a phone. Heavy, matte black casing. Reinforced frame, encrypted keypad hardware, built for one purpose, and that purpose wasn't sending messages. "Satellite phone," Elliot said. "Runs on a separate network, no standard telecom infrastructure." He rotated the screen to face me. "It has a direct line into secure international banking systems." A number was already displayed waiting. He held the device out across the console toward me. "Take it?" I stared at it for a moment. Then I reached out. The weight of it surprised me, dense and solid against my rough, calloused palm. I pressed the green button. The call connected at once. For several seconds, the only sound was rain ticking softly against the Rolls-Royce's bulletproof glass. Then a click. A voice came on, composed precise with a European cadence that left no doubt about where the call had landed. "You have reached the Private Client Executive Division of Geneva Central Banking Group," it said. A brief silence followed. "Please state your secure account identification code." I sat there with the receiver pressed to my ear, and something became undeniable to me in that moment. Elliot had not found me tonight by chance. This had been planned carefully, patiently, probably for longer than I could guess. I let my eyes fall shut for just a second and pushed my memory back exactly 5 years. It returned with a clarity that startled me. When I first put my signature on the legal paperwork, establishing the blind trust, the cautious attorney overseeing the offshore transfer had insisted on building in a failsafe. He'd walked me through it, carefully stressing that moving $500,000 into an international corporate entity required a master override mechanism in case the managing director ever acts against the interests of the primary shareholder, he had said. At the time, I'd considered it an unnecessary precaution. Rowan had been family. I trusted him with everything. Even so, the lawyer had held firm. And so, the system was put in place. My mind sharpened through decades of mechanical work to retain thousands of engine specifications, torque values, and part numbers had locked in the security sequence without effort. The long string of letters and numbers rose to the surface cleanly. "I am calling to initiate a complete master override on the Halcott Holding Trust," I said evenly into the satellite phone. My voice didn't waver. "The primary account identifier is Delta 7 Tango 9 Echo 442. A brief pause followed. Then came the rapid clicking of keys on the other end of the line. "I can locate the trust within our international registry." The banker replied with measured precision. His tone carried the particular quality of someone trained to handle enormous sums of money. "However, this account is currently under the management authority of a registered corporate director. To override that authority, we must confirm the identity of the primary equity holder through our multi-tier authentication protocol." "Proceed," I said quietly. I fixed my gaze on the dark leather partition between us and the driver. "I am ready," the banker began. "What was the make, model, and year of the first vehicle you personally restored?" The question didn't slow me even a fraction of a second. "A 1968 Ford Mustang, boss. 429, I answered without hesitation. "Painted midnight blue." A pause followed. "Correct," the banker said. The clicking of keys resumed. "Next question. What was the maiden name of the woman you married in the winter of 1971? For just a moment, a sharp ache moved through my chest. My wife. The image of her smile surfaced in my mind, but I pushed the feeling aside. "Whitmore," I said firmly. Her maiden name was Whitmore. We had carried the same last name before we ever crossed paths. The typing continued. "That answer is verified." The banker's voice held steady. "We will now proceed to the final authentication layer." My grip on the satellite phone tightened slightly. "To authorize a global freeze on a corporate entity of this scale," the banker continued, "the primary equity holder must provide the master security passphrase established at the time the trust was created." I drew in a slow breath. Outside, rain continued to strike the Rolls-Royce Ghost's windows in steady rhythms. Across from me, Elliot sat without a word. His eyes were fixed on me, measuring every small movement. He understood precisely what was unfolding. The power I held at that moment was immense. 5 years earlier, when I chose the passphrase, I had done it for one simple reason. I wanted Rowan to remember where his salvation had truly come from, even if my name never appeared anywhere in the official documents. "The master passphrase is rust and ruined iron," I said clearly. I made sure every word carried through the encrypted connection. "Rust and ruined iron." The line went silent. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. I could make out the faint digital hum of the satellite signal, carrying my voice across the ocean. My heartbeat stayed even. Something inside me had shifted tonight. I was no longer the broken old man sitting on a rain-soaked driveway. I was the man who had built the empire, and I was finally taking it back. The banker returned to the line. His voice was exactly as it had been, calm, professional, giving nothing away. But there was an unmistakable weight behind it now. Voice verification complete. "Mr. Whitmore." A brief pause followed. "All corporate and personal financial accounts connected to Rowan Halcott are now frozen." The words settled into the quiet cabin, like the final strike of a judge's gavel. It was done. 5 years of betrayal had been undone in a single phone call. I lowered the satellite phone slowly. The click of the disconnected line sounded sharper than I'd expected. For a moment, I simply sat there, letting the reality of what had just happened settle over me. Rowan's empire, his company accounts, his investments, his personal assets had all been locked down. The financial lifeblood of his operation had been severed completely. I passed the phone back to Elliot. He took it with a small, satisfied nod and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. The heavy silence inside the Rolls-Royce Ghost carried its own meaning. Somewhere in the hills behind us, Rowan Halcott was still celebrating. He was probably standing in the thick of his lavish party, lifting a glass of champagne, flashing his smile at wealthy investors who believed they were on the verge of a lucrative opportunity. He had no idea what had just taken place. The empire he thought he commanded had just been locked down by the man he'd thrown out into the rain. Elliot reached for the tablet resting on the console. His fingers moved quickly across the screen. A secure application opened, showing a grid of video feeds, security cameras. Elliot turned the tablet toward me. "Let's watch what happens next," he said quietly. On the screen, the grand foyer of the River Oaks estate came into view. Crystal chandeliers glowed above. Elegant guests drifted across the marble floor, holding champagne flutes and speaking in animated clusters. In the center of the room stood Rowan, perfectly dressed, composed, smiling, as he held court before a small circle of investors. He looked exactly like the successful entrepreneur everyone in that room believed him to be. But now I knew something none of them did. Within minutes, Rowan Halcott's world was going to come apart. My eyes narrowed as I focused on the tablet in Elliot's hand. The image on the screen sharpened into crisp clarity, and it quickly became plain that what I was looking at was no simple digital map. It was a live feed, a high-definition broadcast, streaming directly from inside the River Oaks estate. For a moment, I just stared. Vanguard Holdings doesn't only freeze bank accounts, Gerald Elliott explained in an even tone. His voice carried the steady, almost mechanical confidence of someone who had run operations like this many times before. About 10 minutes ago, my intelligence team gained administrative control of Rowan's smart home network. He gestured casually at the screen. That means we now control everything connected to it. Every security camera, every electronic door lock, every light system, and every alarm in the house. I leaned forward without realizing it, my attention completely swallowed by the scene unfolding before me. The camera feeds swept across the enormous foyer and into the grand ballroom. The party was running at full force. More than 150 of the wealthiest people in California filled the space beneath glittering crystal chandeliers. Their voices blended into a warm hum of laughter and conversation as they moved through the room in polished clusters. Servers dressed in crisp black dinner jackets moved smoothly between guests, balancing silver trays loaded with delicate appetizers and flutes of champagne. The atmosphere radiated wealth, power, and privilege, and right there at the center of it all stood Rowan. He looked exactly as he always did when he wanted to make an impression. Tailored tuxedo, commanding posture, a glass of vintage wine turning slowly in his hand. He stood surrounded by a small group of older men in expensive suits, private investors. I recognized them at once. These were the men he intended to deceive. Rowan smiled broadly, speaking with animated charm, clearly savoring the attention of his audience. From the outside, he looked like a man in total command of his empire, confident, untouchable, a king, presiding over his court. He had no idea that only minutes earlier, the financial ground beneath his polished Italian shoes had disappeared. As I watched the performance, another figure moved into the camera's frame. It was the head caterer. The man wore a dark suit and carried a small digital payment terminal in one hand. His movements were careful, almost nervous as he approached Rowan. He waited politely for a small break in the conversation, before leaning slightly forward and whispering something into Rowan's ear. I couldn't make out the audio, but I already knew what was happening. Elliot touched the screen and expanded that particular camera feed. The image zoomed in until Rowan and the caterer filled the entire display. The catering company requires final payment before serving the main course, Elliot said, calmly narrating the moment like a chess commentator watching a match unfold. $50,000 for the imported caviar and vintage champagne. He paused slightly. They don't extend credit. Rowan rolled his eyes in irritation. The interruption clearly grated on him. Even so, he recovered instantly, offering the investors around him an easy, confident smile before excusing himself for a moment. Then he reached smoothly into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. From it, he produced a sleek black metal credit card, a Chase Sapphire Reserve black card, the kind issued only to individuals of extraordinary wealth. To most people, it was a symbol of limitless spending power. Rowan didn't even glance at the caterer as he held it out. The gesture was casual, dismissive, as though $50,000 were nothing more than pocket change. The caterer accepted the card respectfully and slotted it into the payment terminal. His fingers worked quickly across the keypad as he keyed in the charge, $50,000. Then he waited. Several seconds went by. The caterer's expression changed. His brow creased as he stared down at the screen. He pulled the card out, wiped the chip against his jacket sleeve, and ran it again. Rowan noticed the holdup. That charming smile of his dimmed slightly. He leaned in toward the caterer, speaking under his breath, but the impatience was plain to see. The caterer shook his head. Then he turned the payment terminal around so Rowan could see the display. Even without sound, the message was unmistakable. Declined. A cold wave of satisfaction tightened in my chest. The first domino had fallen. Rowan's reaction was instant. He snatched the black card back from the caterer's hand, his face going red with sudden embarrassment. Around him, the investors carried on chatting among themselves, though a few had begun glancing over at the exchange with mild curiosity. Rowan moved quickly to open his wallet. From it, he drew a second card, a platinum corporate credit card tied directly to his real estate holding company. His movements had lost their smoothness. They were clipped tight. He handed the second card to the caterer while stealing nervous glances back at the investors. The caterer ran it. The machine worked through the payment request. 1 second, 2, 3, 5 long seconds elapsed. Then the red light flashed again. Declined. Rowan stared at the terminal as though it had turned on him personally. For a beat, he didn't move at all. The polished businessman who had been charming investors only moments before suddenly looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. The arrogance, the swagger, the illusion of command, all of it evaporated in a single instant. Rowan's hand went to his phone. His fingers were trembling now. Elliot slid his finger across the tablet screen. The camera feed tightened, zooming in on the glowing display of Rowan's smartphone. A torrent of notifications flooded the screen. Alerts, warnings, account suspended, corporate access, denied, assets frozen. Message after message stacked up in rapid succession. Every financial institution Rowan had ever leaned on had just shut him out. His empire, the accounts, the companies, the personal credit lines had all been locked down in the same moment. The color drained from Rowan's face. The blood left his cheeks until his skin looked nearly translucent beneath the chandelier light. His breathing turned shallow and ragged as the truth began working its way in. For the first time that night, Rowan Halcott looked exactly like what he truly was, a man whose entire world had just crumbled beneath him. But the nightmare taking shape inside that estate was only just getting started. As Rowan stood there staring at the frozen bank alert strobing across his phone, another notification slid into view at the top of the screen. It arrived without a sound, gliding into position above the financial warnings, like the final nail in a coffin, an encrypted text message. The sender's number was unknown, but the words burning on that glowing screen were chillingly clear. Time is up. We are coming to collect. Rowan went rigid. The security camera caught every detail in sharp, unforgiving clarity. His eyes widened as he read the message. For a moment, it seemed as though the air had been torn clean out of his lungs. Those 5 words hung there like a death warrant. The Russian syndicate had made their move. I watched his chest begin rising and falling in quick, uneven surges, his breathing stripped of any calm. The man who had looked so polished and untouchable only minutes earlier suddenly seemed diminished, smaller, exposed. His perfectly tailored tuxedo, once a declaration of wealth and authority, now looked like a costume worn by someone who had lost the plot entirely. Rowan shoved the phone back into his pocket with shaking fingers. Then he began scanning the ballroom. His eyes cut toward the front entrance of the estate, searching the heavy oak doors, as though expecting them to fly open at any second. He understood exactly what the message meant. The men he owed $10 million to were no longer biding their time. They were coming, and they were coming now. Watching him come apart stirred something deep and quiet inside me, a sense of justice long overdue. For years he had treated me as though I were worthless, a burden to be discarded. Now, the mask was splitting open. For the first time, Rowan Halcott looked truly genuinely afraid. But just as I let myself hold on to that grim satisfaction for a moment, Elliot reached forward and pressed a button on the side of the tablet. The screen went black in an instant. The live feed vanished. The glowing ballroom, the terrified man standing in its center, the whole unraveling scene gone in a single second. The interior lights of the Rolls-Royce Ghost caught the dark screen as silence reclaimed the cabin. I turned toward Elliot confused. "Why did you shut it off?" I asked, an edge in my voice. "I want to see what happens when those men come through his doors." Elliot stayed calm. He poured the last measure of scotch into his glass before he answered. "Watching him panic is satisfying," he admitted. "But that's not why we came out here tonight." He took a slow sip. "Our objective goes far beyond humiliating Rowan Halcott." Elliot set the glass down carefully on the console. "His finances are in ruins. His corporate accounts are locked. He can no longer reach into those investors' pockets." He paused slightly. "And the Russian syndicate will handle what's left of his problems soon enough." Elliot settled back against the leather seat. "But we are dealing with a man who built his entire career manipulating systems and rewriting the narrative around him." His gaze met mine. "And right now, Rowan is a cornered animal. He let that sit. Cornered animals are dangerous." I shifted in my seat, the cold dampness of my rain-soaked suit pressing uncomfortably against my skin. "If we pull away tonight," Elliot continued, "and leave him to face the fallout on his own, we leave one very serious loophole open." I frowned. "What loophole?" I gestured toward the folder resting on the console. "I froze every corporate account he controls. I used the master override. His empire is finished." Elliot shook his head slowly. "Financial destruction is not the same as legal justice." His voice was steady and firm. "Right now, Rowan Halcott is broke. Completely broke." He paused. "But come morning, law enforcement will get involved." Elliot leaned forward slightly. "And the moment that happens, Rowan will retain the most aggressive defense attorneys money can buy." He watched my reaction carefully. "Those lawyers will look at the account, freeze you triggered tonight, and call it a misunderstanding." My stomach tightened. "They will argue that you, an elderly man with deteriorating memory, became confused and accidentally set off the override." Elliot's tone stayed analytical. "They will claim you misread the legal structure of the trust." My jaw hardened. "And they will produce the document you signed last month, the equity waiver." Elliot pressed on. "They will argue that you voluntarily gave up your 80% ownership stake and that you are nothing more than a bitter father-in-law trying to tear down a successful entrepreneur." The words set something burning in my chest. "They will reframe the entire story," Elliot said evenly. "They will insist Rowan never forged a thing, and without hard evidence, federal prosecutors will have nothing solid to bring against him." The reality landed on me like cold water. Rowan had always been a master manipulator. Even now, with criminals hunting him and his finances in rubble, he might still find a way out. If he escaped prison, he would simply rebuild somewhere else and go right on doing what he had always done. "What do we need?" I asked quietly. The edge in my voice had sharpened. "What evidence puts him away for good?" Elliot set his glass down. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation will need the original trust contract." He spoke with precise clarity. "The physical document, the one you signed 5 years ago." Elliot tapped the folder gently. "We need the original paper bearing the wet ink signatures." He paused. "That document establishes the structure of the trust. It proves that the equity waiver Rowan slipped into those medical forms directly contradicts the original legal charter." Elliot looked straight at me. "A digital copy won't survive the courtroom. His attorneys will shred it, but the original contract." He allowed himself a thin smile. "That will destroy him." I closed my eyes. My mind went back to that day of 5 years earlier. I had trusted Rowan with my investment, but I hadn't been careless enough to leave something that critical within reach inside his house. "I still have it," I said quietly. I opened my eyes. I placed the original contract in a secure safety deposit box. Elliot leaned slightly forward. "We're a private vault facility in downtown Houston," I said slowly. "No one else knows it exists, and no one else holds the authority to access it." Elliot nodded once. "Excellent." His voice sharpened with renewed purpose. "Then we retrieve it immediately." He gestured toward the dark highway stretching ahead of us. "We collect the contract, and we take it directly to my contacts inside the Federal Bureau." Elliot's eyes held mine. Once the FBI has that document, Rowan Halcott will never see freedom again. He paused briefly. Do you have the key to the vault with you? The question hung in the air. We are right at the edge now, the moment where everything Gerald quietly carried is about to be put to the test in a way he never anticipated. Before we get there, let me ask you something. If you discovered that someone you loved had been quietly working against you from the very beginning, would you have found it in yourself to act, or would the betrayal have broken you first? For a moment I said nothing. Instead, a sickening realization began taking shape in my gut. My mind shot back to the estate, the grand foyer, the shattered wooden box lying across the marble floor, and the small titanium key that had slipped from my trembling hands. I could see my daughter standing there in that extravagant gown of hers. I could see the contempt written across her face. Then I saw the small hand-carved oak box falling from my fingers, striking the marble floor and splitting apart. I turned toward the rain-streaked window of the Rolls-Royce Ghost, staring back up the long driveway toward the estate. The realization was crushing. It is in a safety deposit box. I whispered, my voice unsteady as the horrifying truth pressed down on me, and the only titanium key to open it had been inside the hand-carved wooden box my daughter just kicked into the mud. Elliot stared at me, those cold, calculating eyes widening by just a fraction as my words hung in the heavy air of the cabin. The absolute silence inside the vehicle suddenly felt suffocating. He set the heavy cut-glass decanter down onto the polished mahogany console, the soft clink ringing out like a gunshot in the enclosed space. A small titanium key. Elliot repeated it, his voice low and razor-sharp. You are telling me that the only physical means of accessing the master trust document, the single piece of evidence capable of putting Rowan Halcott in federal prison and saving my corporate acquisition, was just kicked out into the pouring rain by a spoiled 35-year-old woman? I nodded slowly, a bitter taste climbing the back of my dry throat. Yes, I whispered, my eyes fixed on the dark, winding road behind us through the tinted glass. I spent 3 full months carefully carving that small oak box. I wanted to give her something with real meaning behind it for her birthday. I set the titanium vault key inside, resting it on a small square of velvet. When I tried to present it to her in the grand foyer, she slapped me. The box dropped and shattered against the hard marble floor. And when Rowan ordered his security to haul me out of the house, I watched one of the servers kick the broken pieces of wood straight through the front doors. It is sitting out there in the freezing mud, completely at the mercy of the elements. Elliot cursed under his breath, a rare crack in his otherwise seamless professional composure. He lunged forward and snatched up the glowing tablet, his fingers cutting rapidly across the screen as he switched back to the live security camera feeds. He bypassed the interior cameras covering the chaos in the ballroom and pulled up the exterior perimeter surveillance network. The high-definition display lit up the massive front gates and the wide circular driveway of the River Oaks estate. Rain was coming down in thick gray sheets, turning the immaculate grounds into a dark, sodden mess. We both leaned in, scanning the wet pavement desperately for any trace of the splintered oak box or the glint of the key, but the driveway was vast, and the storm was hammering the camera visibility down to almost nothing. We cannot leave it out there, I said, my heart beginning to pound with a cold, rising panic. If Rowan somehow survives tonight, if he finds a way to buy time against the Russian syndicate, he will eventually trace the digital freeze back to me. He will go looking for the original documents. Elliot shook his head, his jaw drawn tight. It is far worse than that, Gerald, he replied grimly. Look at the lower right corner of the feed. I leaned in and squinted at the small screen. Through the thick curtain of driving rain, I could make out 2 men in dark raincoats pushing a heavy industrial trash cart along the edge of the driveway. They were members of the estate's private groundskeeping crew. Rowan is a relentless perfectionist when it comes to his public image. Elliot explained, his voice sharpening with sudden urgency. He keeps a dedicated crew patrolling the exterior of his property throughout major events. They sweep up dropped napkins, cigarette butts, anything that might offend his wealthy guests. They are actively working the driveway right now. I watched in absolute horror as one of the groundskeepers dragged a wide broom across the wet asphalt, pushing a heap of wet leaves, mud, and debris straight toward the large plastic trash cart. If they sweep up the pieces of your wooden box, Elliot continued, his tone going deadly serious, they will dump everything directly into the commercial incinerator behind the guest house. the estate burns all its event refuse as part of its security protocols. If that titanium key goes into the fire, it will melt down to an unrecognizable piece of slag. The evidence will be gone forever, and your son-in-law walks away a free man. The full weight of what was at stake crashed down inside that luxury cabin. Everything we had just achieved, the frozen bank accounts, the locked corporate assets, the precise digital ambush, would be rendered completely worthless if Rowan could simply argue that his forged medical waiver was the only surviving legal document. He would spin a sympathetic tale for the federal judges. He would work the justice system the way he had worked every room in his life, holding on to his stolen millions, while I was left to die with nothing. The image of him standing in a courtroom, in one of his expensive suits, smiling, while my entire life dissolved into smoke, that image ignited something deep and fierce inside my chest. I was finished being the victim. I was finished living in the shadow of my own stolen wealth. I reached out and eased the silver tablet down, turning it away from Elliot. I looked across at the powerful Wall Street billionaire sitting opposite me. He was waiting quietly, taking stock of whether the broken old mechanic across from him had the real steel to see this brutal war through to the end. I drew a long, steady breath, feeling the cold, damp fabric of my ruined clothes clinging to my skin. But I did not feel broken anymore. What I felt was a clear, overwhelming surge of resolve, absolute and unshakable. I turned and looked directly at the thick, soundproof glass partition between us and the driver. Turn this car around. Right now. I said it like a command, my voice filling the quiet cabin with an authority that seemed to surprise even me. Elliot raised an eyebrow. A faint, dangerous smile crossed his face. He pressed a silver button and relayed the order. I straightened my wine-stained jacket. We are crashing the party. The massive tires of the midnight black Rolls-Royce Ghost shrieked against the wet asphalt as the driver executed a sharp, aggressive turn in the middle of the dark road. The powerful engine growled a deep guttural sound that matched exactly the fury now burning inside my chest. I settled back against the leather seat, both hands resting steady on my knees. I was no longer trembling from the cold or from the sting of my daughter's cruelty. Every last trace of fear had been burned away, leaving only a cold, hardened resolve in its place. We were heading back into the belly of the beast. The rain kept hammering the windshield, but the Rolls-Royce Ghost carved through the storm without effort. Elliot sat in silence across from me, his dark eyes fixed on the glowing tablet as he tracked the live feeds from the estate. The winding road climbing back into the exclusive hills of River Oaks blurred past in a rush of shadowed trees and amber street lamps. Within minutes, the heavily fortified front entrance of the $15 million estate came into view. Under ordinary circumstances, visitors stopped at a secure intercom, stated their business, and waited for the wrought iron gates to swing open. Tonight, however, Rowan had ordered his staff to leave the gates wide open to accommodate the steady flow of luxury vehicles and wealthy guests. In their place, the groundskeeping crew had erected an elaborate arrangement of towering floral displays, velvet ropes, and temporary valet stands to frame a grand entrance for the exclusive birthday party. 2 security guards in bright yellow raincoats stood at the center of the entrance, holding glowing traffic wands to direct arriving guests. I expected the driver to ease off the accelerator, pull smoothly up to the valet stand, and let us step out like civilized men. But Elliot had passed a very different set of instructions through his secure earpiece. The Rolls-Royce Ghost did not slow down by a single fraction. Instead, the driver pressed his foot hard onto the accelerator. The engine surged with terrifying power. The 2 security guards posted by the velvet ropes threw themselves frantically out of the way, eyes wide with panic, just as the heavy armored front grille of the Rolls-Royce Ghost tore directly into the expensive floral barricade. The impact was enormous. Thick wooden trellises snapped like dry kindling. Hundreds of perfectly arranged white roses and costly orchids exploded into the dark, rain-soaked sky. The velvet ropes ripped free from their brass stanchions, whipping wildly through the freezing air. The Rolls-Royce Ghost obliterated the grand, welcoming entrance, completely leaving a trail of crushed flowers and broken wood scattered in its wake. We barreled up the long, circular driveway, the wide tires hurling great waves of muddy water into the night. The car finally slid to a violent, shuddering stop directly in front of the grand marble steps of the main entrance, cutting off a gleaming white Porsche Panamera that belonged to one of the terrified tech investors. Absolute chaos erupted outside the thick, soundproof glass. The crashing impact had immediately triggered Rowan's entire private security detail. Within seconds, more than a dozen large men in matching dark suits poured out from the shadows across the property. They closed in around the midnight black Rolls-Royce ghost faces, set in expressions of aggressive trained hostility. Several reached beneath their jacket lapels, hands resting on the weapons holstered at their hips. The head of the security detail, a towering, heavily built man with a thick beard, marched toward the side of our vehicle, clearly intending to wrench the door open and drag us out into the rain. A sudden spike of adrenaline moved through me. We were completely encircled, but Elliot Voss simply smiled, a cold, predatory expression that radiated absolute unsettling control. He calmly reached over and pressed a small silver button on the polished center console. The heavy locks on the Rolls-Royce Ghost disengaged with a solid, satisfying click. In the same instant, the doors of the two large black Suburbans that had been trailing quietly behind us swung open. 6 of Elliot's elite private bodyguards stepped out into the driving rain. No shouting, no waving. They simply moved with precise, unhurried purpose, forming a tight, impenetrable wall of muscle and dark suits around our vehicle. The head of Rowan's security detail stopped dead. His eyes moved nervously between Elliot's men. Elliot pressed another button, lowering his tinted window by just a few inches. The freezing rain blew immediately into the warm cabin, carrying with it the noise and chaos from outside. Rowan's head of security leaned down, face flushed and furious, ready to unload on whoever was sitting in that car. But the moment his eyes met Elliot's cold, steady gaze through that narrow gap in the glass, every drop of color left his face. Elliot spoke almost gently. "Good evening, Dade. I trust the funds cleared without complications." The massive security chief seemed to collapse inward. His hand fell away from his weapon. "Yes, Mr. Voss," Dade answered, betraying Rowan without a moment's hesitation. "Stand down," he called out to his men, waving them back. Dade pulled our door open with both hands. Flanked by men in black, I stepped out and moved toward the front entrance. Less than an hour ago, I had been thrown out of those same doors. The moment I stepped back through them, the atmosphere inside the grand foyer lurched. The jazz trio stopped playing mid-measure. The elegant chatter of wealthy socialites cut off in an instant, replaced by a thick and suffocating silence. Every pair of eyes in that vaulted room turned to look at the wine-soaked old man who had been thrown into the freezing rain not an hour before. I walked slowly across the imported Italian marble, my worn shoes leaving faint wet tracks behind me. Elliot Voss followed at my right shoulder, flanked by his bodyguards. We moved like a military formation, cutting through hostile ground. Rowan was standing near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a cluster of wealthy tech investors. He was mid-pitch, hands working the air as he pressed them toward signing his fraudulent contracts. The moment he caught sight of me moving toward him, every trace of color left his face. The gold-plated pen he had been holding slipped from his fingers and struck the polished mahogany table with a sharp clatter. What are you doing here?" Rowan stammered, his voice fracturing with barely suppressed panic. "Dade, where the hell is my security?" The head of security stood near the entrance, with his arms folded, making no move at all to intervene. I stopped directly in front of Rowan, close enough to see the beads of cold sweat forming on his forehead. I did not raise my voice. There was no need. "I am here to reclaim what is mine." The words came out quietly, yet they carried across that dead silent ballroom with complete clarity. Rowan's mouth worked open and shut. He looked desperately at the investors around him, silently pleading for someone to validate him, to take his side. But the older man standing nearest the table, a silver-haired billionaire, whose face I recognized from magazine covers, took one slow, deliberate step backward, putting distance between himself and the disgraced executive. "Elliot Voss, the silver-haired man," whispered his voice, barely reaching above a breath. The name moved through the circle of investors like a current, carrying a note of fearful reverence that instantly shifted the entire room. Rowan, still visibly rattled from his outburst, finally pulled his eyes away from my wine-stained shirt. He followed the billionaire's unnerved gaze and registered for the first time the imposing figure standing in the shadows just behind my right shoulder. The change that came over Rowan was immediate and nauseating to witness. The flush of anger drained out of his face and was replaced at once by a pale, hungry eagerness. He recognized Elliot instantly. Every ambitious executive in the country knew the name and face of the chief executive of Vanguard Holdings. Rowan's panicked mind, completely blind to the trap closing around him, wildly misread the entire situation. He actually believed Elliot Voss had crashed this private birthday party to swoop in with a last-minute investment in his crumbling company. Rowan quickly smoothed the damp lapels of his custom tuxedo. Desperate to reclaim his shattered composure, he pressed a wide, charming smile onto his face and stepped cleanly around me, as though I were a piece of broken furniture standing in his path. He moved toward the Wall Street titan with his hand already extended. "Mr. Voss," Rowan said, his voice thick with a reverence that turned my stomach. "What an extraordinary honor to have you here in my home tonight. I had no idea you were in California. Had my staff known, we would have arranged a proper reception for you. Please come in." Rowan swept his arm toward the three billionaires who stood watching Elliot in stunned, wary silence. "We are just closing out a very exciting round of exclusive funding, but there is always a seat at the table for Vanguard Holdings. We have long hoped to partner with your organization. Allow me to have my security remove this confused old man so we can discuss real business in my private office. Right now?" Elliot did not look at the outstretched hand. He did not acknowledge the greeting at all. Instead, he stepped out of the shadows, his tailored suit perfectly dry and immaculate, a stark contrast to my soaked and ruined clothes. He moved with the quiet, unhurried grace of a predator that has already decided how this ends. He walked straight past Rowan, leaving him standing with his hand hanging in empty air, and stopped in front of the polished mahogany table. He looked down at the three heavy leather portfolios holding the fraudulent $15 million contracts. Slowly and deliberately, he reached out and closed the cover of the nearest one. Then he turned his cold gaze back to Rowan. Without a word, Elliot reached out and took firm hold of the silver microphone Rowan was still gripping in his left hand. For one brief, desperate moment, Rowan tried to hold on. Elliot's grip was iron. He pulled the microphone away cleanly, stripping Rowan of his voice and his authority in front of every person in that room. The look of devastation that crept across Rowan's face in that moment was worth every second of the anguish I had endured across the previous 5 years. Elliot tapped the top of the microphone once. The sharp electronic crack rang through the dead, silent ballroom. Every wealthy guest and tech executive in that room leaned forward, riveted by the drama unfolding in front of them. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared draw too much attention to themselves with even a breath. They could all feel it. Something enormous and final was about to happen inside that $15 million estate. The air was dense with tension, heavy enough to press down on your chest. The lavish birthday party had transformed in the space of minutes into a brutal courtroom, and Rowan Halcott stood at its center completely defenseless, still unaware of the full magnitude of the storm that had just walked through his own front doors. Elliot turned his back on Rowan, dismissing him completely, and looked directly at the three billionaire investors standing frozen at the table. He drew a breath, commanding the full attention of every soul in that room. "Gentlemen," Elliot announced, his deep voice resonating through the grand foyer's speakers with quiet authority, "I would strongly advise you to put your pens away. Do not sign that contract." That sudden, forceful declaration hit the hushed room like a physical shockwave. Rowan gasped, lurching forward on pure, blind instinct hands, reaching out as though he might somehow claw those damaging words back out of the air. He began stammering, desperately grasping for a coherent sentence that might hold his crumbling empire together. His panicked mind gave him nothing. He was completely trapped. Elliot raised a single authoritative hand, cutting off the broken man before a syllable could escape. "The man who was holding this microphone moments ago is a fraud." Elliot continued his tone, clinical, ruthless, without a trace of mercy. "He does not own this real estate empire. He has no legal authority to sell you a single share of corporate equity tonight. The true 80% majority shareholder of this entire corporation, the man who built it from nothing, is standing right here." Elliot turned and pointed directly at me. "It is Mr. Gerald Whitmore, the man you just threw out into the freezing rain." The gasp from the assembled guests rolled through the foyer like a thunderclap. The silence broke apart into a surge of frantic whispers. The three billionaire investors stepped back sharply from the mahogany table. They looked at Rowan the way you look at something suddenly revealed to be dangerous. The gold pen sat untouched on the table. The $15 million fraudulent contracts remained unsigned. Rowan stood frozen, his styled hair plastered to his damp forehead. His eyes moved frantically between the investors, the Wall Street titan, and finally landed on me. The panic shifted into something raw, pure survival instinct. He threw his hands up, forcing out a hollow laugh. "This is completely ridiculous." Rowan stammered, his voice shaking as he fought to pull the room back. "Please, gentlemen, don't give this another thought. Mr. Voss is clearly the victim of a terrible misunderstanding." He jabbed a trembling finger toward my face, eyes stretched wide with frantic fear. "This old man is my father-in-law, and he is severely ill. He has been living with advanced dementia for over 3 years. His mind is gone. I brought him into my home because he could no longer look after himself. He wanders making up elaborate delusions about owning my company. He owns nothing. He is a sick, confused old man in urgent need of medical care." Rowan looked imploringly at the men around him. "I built this empire from the ground up. Are you really going to let a confused old mechanic destroy a $15 million partnership?" His lies were smooth, well-rehearsed. Years of deceiving the people closest to him had sharpened them to a fine edge. For just a moment, I caught a flicker of doubt moving across the silver-haired investor's face. The lie had real traction with these people. It was simpler to accept that the old man in the ruined suit had lost his mind than to confront the possibility that their charming tech visionary was a serious criminal. I understood that I had to cut the head off the snake right here and right now. I walked slowly past Elliot Voss's bodyguards. I didn't rush. I let every person in that room have a long look at my face. I stopped in front of the polished mahogany table, standing just inches from the man who had taken 5 years of my life. Elliot caught my eye, gave a single approving nod, and placed the silver microphone in my hand. I wrapped my calloused fingers around the cool metal. I took a slow breath, feeling the full weight of the moment settle across my shoulders. When I spoke, my voice did not waver. It rang through the vaulted ceilings with the clear, unshakable authority of a man who knows precisely where he stands. "My name is Gerald Whitmore," I said, looking directly into the eyes of the 3 billionaire investors. "And my mind is perfectly clear. 5 years ago, my son-in-law arrived at my modest home in Cleveland. He was bankrupt, drowning in personal debt, weeping like a desperate child. He begged me to save his career. I sold my mechanic shop. I cashed out my retirement fund. I took exactly $500 every penny I had to my name, and I handed it to him. Because he was terrified of his wife finding out, he made me place the money inside a highly secure blind trust. The ballroom hung in total silence, every person in it holding on to my words. Because of the precise legal structure of that trust, I continued my voice gathering strength with every sentence that $500,000 was used as the sole initial seed capital for this entire holding company. Rowan never bought me out. He simply buried the truth. That original investment compounded in full, leaving me as the sole legal owner of exactly 80% of this entire corporate enterprise. Rowan gasped, stumbling backward. "No!" He breathed weakly, the color gone from his face, as his buried secrets were dragged one by one into the open. "Just 1 month ago," I said, turning my gaze back to the crowd, he handed me a stack of what he called routine medical insurance forms. He used my trust in him as a weapon. Hidden inside those papers was a fraudulent equity waiver. He tricked me into signing away my 80% ownership stake so he could steal the company out from under me entirely. He believed I was just an uneducated old man who wouldn't notice. He thought he could throw me out into the rain tonight, finalize his theft by morning, and wash his hands of me forever. I took a step closer to Rowan. His eyes were already darting desperately toward the front doors. "But the worst part of his deception is why he invited every one of you here tonight," I said, pointing directly at the 3 horrified tech investors. "You are not here to celebrate my daughter's birthday. You are here because Rowan Halcott currently owes exactly $10 million to a highly organized, dangerous Russian syndicate. He lost the capital at underground high-stakes poker tables. He brought you here tonight to trick you into signing those contracts so he could take your $15 million, settle his debt with the mob, and leave you holding an empty, debt-ridden shell." The room erupted into full chaos. The wealthy investors cursed aloud, snatching up their coats and pushing back from the table. The illusion had shattered completely. Rowan sank to his knees, the last of his strength draining out of him entirely. I looked down at the trembling, broken man who had taken everything from me. I looked straight into his wide, terrified eyes, raised the silver microphone to my lips, and delivered the final blow. As majority shareholder, I am officially declaring this company bankrupt and liquidating all assets. You have nothing. The silence that followed lasted less than a heartbeat. Then the entire room came apart. The three billionaire investors moved without hesitation. Men who had built fortunes on risk had no trouble recognizing catastrophe when it was right in front of them. They knew instinctively when something had turned poisonous, when a ship had already gone under. The silver-haired investor shoved his chair back so hard it scraped loudly across the marble floor. The gold-plated pen he had been holding rolled across the polished mahogany table and came to rest beside the fraudulent $15 million contract. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he gave a sharp hand signal to the two large men standing discreetly near the wall, his own security. Within moments, the other two investors followed. Chairs scraped back. Jackets were pulled tight. Phones slipped into pockets as the three men moved quickly away from the table. The composed masks were gone now. Pure instinct had taken over. They pushed through the stunned crowd of guests, brushing past confused questions and startled protests, heading straight for the front entrance. Not one of them looked back. Within minutes they were gone, and with them walked the last chance Rowan had of surviving the night. A wave of anxious whispers rolled through the ballroom as the guests tried to make sense of what had just unfolded. At the center of the wreckage, Rowan Halcott remained on his knees. His expensive tuxedo bunched and twisted around him on the marble floor. The once crisp lines of the suit now crumpled and disheveled. His chest heaved in short, ragged bursts as his hands pressed against the sides of his head. He no longer resembled a powerful CEO. He looked like a man watching everything he had ever built collapse in real time. Then a sharp voice cut straight through the rising panic. "What is going on here?" Diane's voice sliced through the ballroom like a blade. My daughter pressed through the crowd of frightened socialites, pushing past guests who were still struggling to absorb what had happened. The skirt of her glittering birthday gown swished furiously around her legs as she stormed into the center of the room. Her eyes found me immediately, and they were burning. "Why are you still here?" she demanded, her voice carrying hard off the vaulted ceilings. "I told security to throw you out. You are ruining my party. You are embarrassing me." Rowan said nothing. He didn't even glance up. He just stared at the marble floor beneath his feet, as though some answer might be carved into the stone. Diane let out a sharp, impatient scoff. To her, this whole thing still looked like nothing grander than a petty domestic squabble. She had no idea the ground beneath her entire existence had already given way. She reached into her glittering diamond-studded clutch and yanked out her phone with an irritated snap of her wrist. "You don't own a thing," she sneered at me. "Rowan is the CEO. Our company is worth tens of millions." Her voice was soaked in arrogant certainty. "I'm calling my private bankers this instant to put an end to this nonsense." Her fingers moved fast across the screen as she pulled up her banking application. I said nothing. I simply stood there and watched. It took less than 3 seconds. The smugness drained from her face so fast it looked almost cartoonish. Her lips fell open as she stared down at the glowing screen in pure disbelief. For a moment, words completely abandoned her. The pale light of the phone threw her expression into sharp relief, showing exactly what she was reading. Every account, every credit line, every joint investment, zero frozen gone. Her hand began to shake. "We're broke," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Her eyes shot toward Rowan. "All of our accounts are locked." Her breathing turned shallow as the truth finally forced its way through. "We have nothing." But before Rowan could even begin to respond, the atmosphere inside the grand foyer shifted again. And this time, the shift was far more threatening than frozen bank accounts. The howl of the storm outside was sliced open by the high-pitched wail of approaching sirens. The sound swelled, growing louder and more aggressive with every passing second, echoing ominously through the exclusive hills of River Oaks. The massive arched windows overlooking the circular driveway blazed with a frantic strobing wash of red and blue light. The flashing colors slashed violently through the driving rain, throwing jagged shadows across the imported Italian marble floors. The remaining party guests, already deeply rattled by the corporate scandal, unraveling right in front of them, dissolved into full panic. Wealthy tech executives celebrated socialites, and powerful politicians scrambled frantically toward the side exits, terrified of being photographed or legally tied to whatever massive criminal enterprise was about to be torn apart. They didn't get far. The heavy oak front doors were hurled open with explosive bone-rattling force. More than 24 federal agents flooded into the grand foyer, their heavy tactical boots hammering against the delicate floors. Dark windbreakers bore large, bold yellow letters across their backs, Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with total ruthless precision, instantly sealing every exit and cutting off any chance of escape from the $15 million estate. The lead agent, an imposing man with a grave expression and a thick folder tucked under his arm, planted himself at the center of the chaotic room. He raised his badge high, his commanding voice cutting cleanly through the screams of the panicked elite. "Nobody moves!" His shout carried the weight of undeniable authority. "This entire property is officially on lockdown. We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering." Elliot Voss stood quietly in the shadows beside me. A faint, satisfied smile settled across his lips. His elite forensic team had done far more than trace Rowan's illegal syndicate debts. They had handed a perfectly packaged dossier of financial crimes directly into the hands of federal authorities. The terrifying reality of federal prison came crashing down onto Rowan's shoulders. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting wildly as agents began forcefully seizing computers and financial records from his frightened staff. His panicked mind raced through his desperately narrow odds of survival. He understood the massive digital freeze would raise red flags, but he needed his defense attorneys to argue that the fraudulent medical waiver was the only legitimate transfer of corporate equity. For that lie to hold up in federal court, he had to make absolutely certain the authentic trust document was completely and permanently destroyed. And the only physical means of reaching that damning original was sitting inside a small splintered oak box somewhere out in the freezing mud. Rowan suddenly seized the collar of his terrified head butler, shaking the poor, bewildered man violently. "Find the old man's wooden box!" Rowan screamed, his voice raw and fractured completely, disregarding the armed federal agents closing in around him. "I don't care what it costs or what it takes. Go out into the trash. Dig through the freezing mud with your bare hands. Find it." The terrified butler shook uncontrollably in Rowan's grip, utterly paralyzed by the sudden explosion of madness from his employer. The poor man stammered, his eyes darting desperately toward the heavily armed agents advancing rapidly across the grand foyer. Before the butler could manage a coherent word, 2 large federal agents stepped in hard. They grabbed Rowan by the shoulders, wrenched his frantic hands free from the frightened staff member, and shoved the disgraced chief executive back with absolute authority. "Stand down and keep your hands where we can see them." The lead agent's voice rang through the room like a thunderclap. Rowan stumbled backward, breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His expensive custom tuxedo was badly disheveled. The crisp collar crumpled his perfectly styled hair, hanging in damp, tangled strands across his pale, sweat-slicked forehead. He ignored the agents entirely, his wild, bloodshot eyes sweeping the room, the massive oak doors, the arched windows frantically calculating the impossible logistics of locating a tiny wooden box in the middle of a torrential downpour. The sheer desperation radiating off him was a wretched thing to witness. This was the brilliant tech visionary, the untouchable master of a real estate empire, reduced entirely to a frantic, broken animal clawing through garbage to save his own life. A heavy silence settled over the remaining guests and the federal agents thick with anticipation. Every eye in the room watched the spectacular collapse of Rowan Halcott, a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings built from stolen money. I stood there in my wet, ruined clothes, feeling the weight of the room's gaze slowly turning back to me. The burning fury that had carried me through the storm and past his security had settled now into something deep and unshakable. I looked at the man who had stolen my life savings, the man who had ordered me thrown out into the freezing mud like a worthless stray. I watched him come apart at the seams, knowing exactly what he was hunting for, and knowing with absolute certainty he would never find it out there in the dark. "Here are you looking for this Rowan?" I asked. My voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of that grand foyer, it carried with perfect, undeniable clarity. Rowan froze. Every frantic motion stopped at once. He turned his head slowly, his wide, terrified eyes locking onto mine. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as one. I reached my right hand slowly into the deep pocket of my soaked, wine-stained suit jacket, feeling the cold, damp fabric press against my skin. My fingers found the rough, jagged edges of splintered wood, and then the smooth, cold surface of polished metal. I drew my hand out of my pocket and raised it up for the whole room to see. Resting in the center of my calloused palm were the muddy, broken remains of the small oak box I had spent 3 full months carefully carving. The craftsmanship had been utterly destroyed, crushed under the careless heels of his wealthy guests, and soaked through in the filthy puddles of his grand driveway. But resting perfectly unharmed atop the ruined, mud-caked wood was the single object Rowan desperately needed to survive: a highly specialized, custom-milled titanium key. Even beneath the warm, ambient glow of the chandeliers, the cold metal seemed to drink in the light, gleaming with a heavy, undeniable authority. "I found it out in the freezing mud on my way back inside," I said, holding my voice steady and even. "I saw your groundskeepers about to sweep it into the industrial incinerator. You ordered your security to throw my gift away, Rowan. You called it trash. You stood right there and let your wife humiliate me. Let her kick this box aside because it wasn't wrapped in expensive designer paper. You threw away the only thing that could have possibly saved you." Rowan stared at the gleaming titanium key, his jaw trembling uncontrollably, eyes wide with a horrifying realization that shattered whatever remained of his composure. "Do you know what this key opens?" I asked, taking one slow, deliberate step toward him. "This key belongs to a highly secure private safety deposit box located in a subterranean vault in downtown Houston. And inside that specific steel box sits the original unaltered master trust document from exactly 5 years ago. This is the document bearing our wet ink signatures. It is the undeniable physical proof that the medical waiver you tricked me into signing last month is nothing but a malicious forgery. Without this key, you could have lied to the federal judges. You could have argued the digital freeze was some terrible error. You could have walked away with your stolen millions and left me to rot in poverty. But with this key, federal prosecutors have the exact physical evidence they need to put you in a maximum security prison for what remains of your miserable life." The crushing weight of that catastrophic miscalculation finally settled squarely on his shoulders. The brilliant, arrogant chief executive understood at last that his ruin had not been brought about by some cunning corporate rival or a sudden market collapse. His total destruction had been caused entirely by his own cold, unyielding arrogance. He had literally ordered his own staff to throw his only salvation straight into the garbage. The psychological collapse was total and immediate. Rowan's legs simply buckled beneath him. He pitched forward, his knees cracking hard against the imported Italian marble floor. The sharp sound rang through the silent room. His $5,000 custom Italian tuxedo pooled around him, soaking up the wet, muddy tracks left behind by the federal agents. He no longer cared how he looked. He no longer cared about the wealthy socialites watching him or the armed agents standing just feet away. He raised his eyes to mine, his face completely contorted in raw, unfiltered agony. Hot tears spilled rapidly down his pale cheeks, cutting through the heavy sheen of sweat on his forehead. He lifted his trembling hands and clasped them together in a desperate, pathetic gesture of prayer. "Please, Gerald!" Rowan sobbed hysterically, his voice breaking into a high, pitiful whine. "Please, I am begging you, don't do this to me. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I will give you everything back. I will sign the company over to you right now. I will walk away with nothing. Just please, please give me the key. You cannot let them take me to prison. I will not survive in there. You are a good man, Gerald. You are family. Please save me." Rowan's pathetic, broken pleas hung in the stale air of the grand foyer, bouncing off the imported Italian marble walls. He stayed on his knees, hands clasped together, in that desperate posture of supplication, tears streaming down his pale face without stop. The federal agents surrounding him showed not one flicker of sympathy. They had watched countless arrogant, wealthy men crumble exactly like this, when the terrifying reality of federal prison finally caught up with them. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had methodically dismantled my life over the past 5 years. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no anger, just a profound, hollow emptiness. But before I could even part my lips to answer his pathetic begging, a sudden movement caught the edge of my vision. It was Diane. My daughter had been standing off to one side, locked in a state of complete shock from the moment she saw the zero balance on her banking application. But as she watched Rowan groveling on the floor, weeping and frantically offering to surrender the entire corporate empire, something dark and calculating violently snapped awake inside her. She understood with sudden absolute clarity that the ship was fully submerged and Rowan was an anchor chained around her neck. Without a single moment's hesitation, she marched across the wet, muddy floor in her custom designer birthday gown. She stopped directly beside her sobbing husband, drew back her expensive high-heeled shoe, and drove it viciously into his ribs. Rowan gasped in pain, folding sideways onto the hard marble floor and clutching his side. Diane stood over him, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You disgusting monster!" She screamed, her shrill voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "You lied to me. You completely destroyed my life. You told me you were a brilliant entrepreneur. You told me you built this entire company from the ground up. I cannot believe I ever married such a pathetic lying thief. You stole from my own father. You stole from my family to feed your disgusting gambling habits. I hate you. I never want to see your face again." She hurled the words with such venomous hatred that even the hardened federal agents instinctively took a small step back. It was a truly spectacular theatrical performance, a frantic bid to publicly sever every legal and emotional tie to the sinking chief executive. She wanted the wealthy investors, the socialites, and most critically the federal authorities, to see her as nothing but a tragically deceived victim. Once she was satisfied, she had sufficiently established her revulsion for Rowan, she executed a terrifyingly swift emotional pivot. The ferocious anger evaporated from her face in an instant, replaced by an expression of profound, innocent devastation. She turned away from her groaning husband and rushed straight toward me. She gave no thought to the mud or the freezing rainwater dripping from my ruined suit. She threw herself forward, dropping to her knees right before me and seizing the lapels of my cheap wine-stained jacket. Heavy, dramatic tears began pouring down her face, cutting rivers through her perfectly applied makeup. "Daddy!" she cried out, her voice shaking with expertly manufactured sorrow. "Daddy, I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea. I swear to you on my life, I knew nothing about his massive debts or the blind trust. He kept everything hidden from me. He left me completely in the dark." She sobbed loudly, pressing her forehead against my wet chest, her hands clutching my coat like those of a frightened child waking from a nightmare. "I thought the money was lost in the market crash, just like he told you." She went on, her words tumbling out in a frantic, breathless rush. "He controlled every bank account. He controlled every single aspect of our lives. He became so abusive and manipulative. He forced me to say those terrible things to you tonight. He told me that if I didn't throw you out of the party and humiliate you publicly, he would freeze my credit cards and put me out on the street. I was so terrified of him, Daddy. I only slapped you because he made me do it. It was all him. Please, you have to believe me. Please protect me. I am your little girl." I stood there motionless as a statue, listening to her desperate, cascading lies. 40 years of fatherhood swept rapidly through my tired mind. I remembered cradling her as a newborn. I remembered working double shifts at the hot, grimy mechanic shop just to cover her expensive ballet lessons and her out-of-state college tuition. I remembered walking her down the aisle, believing with everything I had that I was entrusting my precious daughter to a man who would love and protect her. For a very long time, there was nothing in this world I wouldn't have done to keep her safe. If she had come to me weeping like this just 1 month earlier, my heart would have shattered completely, and I would have moved mountains to shield her from the consequences bearing down on her. But as I look down at her now, desperately clinging to my ruined clothes and spinning this web of hollow lies, my heart stayed entirely cold. The painful truth was laid out plainly before my eyes. The sweet, innocent daughter I had loved and sacrificed everything for had been gone for a very long time. The woman sobbing at my feet was nothing more than a greedy, hollow shell, a deeply selfish parasite who cared only about her lavish lifestyle, perfectly willing to throw her own husband to the flames the instant the money ran out. She did not love me. She loved only the enormous financial power I suddenly held in my hands. I reached down slowly and wrapped my hands around her wrists. My grip was firm and unyielding, stripped of any parental warmth or gentle tenderness. I forcefully peeled her manicured fingers from my wet jacket and took one slow, deliberate step back, severing the physical connection between us completely. The manufactured tears stopped at once. She looked up at me, her wide eyes flashing with a genuine spike of raw panic, as the realization hit her that her performance was failing entirely to move me. I looked down at her with absolute zero emotion, my voice landing in the quiet, tense room like cracking ice. "Are you sure about that, Diane?" I asked, my tone flat and cold. "And are you absolutely sure you had no idea?" Before she could frantically piece together another lie to save herself, Elliot Voss stepped smoothly out of the shadows directly behind me. The powerful Wall Street billionaire didn't say a single word. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his immaculate custom-tailored suit and drew out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. Elliot held the small silver device between his thumb and forefinger, presenting it like a loaded weapon. The red recording light on top blinked steadily, a tiny beacon of absolute truth in a room suffocating under layers of lies. Diane stared at the digital recorder, her perfectly manicured hands falling slowly away from the wet fabric of my suit jacket, her tear-streaked face contorted in sudden, genuine confusion. She had spent her entire life convinced she was the sharpest mind in any room, utterly certain that her manipulative charm could wipe away any terrible mistake she made. But as I took the sleek audio recorder from Elliot's outstretched hand, I watched the certainty drain completely from her wide eyes. Vanguard Holdings does not simply run standard financial audits when preparing to acquire a multi-million-dollar corporate empire. I explained quietly, looking down at my kneeling daughter. They bring in former intelligence officers. They monitor private servers, intercept encrypted communications, and record cellular calls to verify they are not purchasing a criminal operation. They captured hundreds of hours of your private phone calls, Diane. I raised the device high enough for the entire room to see it clearly. The armed federal agents stood perfectly still, hands resting carefully on their tactical belts, completely absorbed by the family drama playing out before them. Even Rowan stopped his pathetic, hysterical sobbing, slowly lifting his heavy head from the cold marble floor to stare at the small silver machine. Every ambient sound in the grand foyer fell away into dead silence. I did not hesitate another moment. I pressed the play button firmly on the side of the device. A brief hiss of digital static filled the room, at once followed immediately by the crystal-clear audio of a telephone conversation. It was a recorded call from exactly 2 days ago, and the voice resonating through the massive acoustics of the luxury estate did not belong to Rowan. It belonged entirely to the woman kneeling right at my feet. The arrogant, deeply impatient tone of my daughter's recorded voice cut through the heavy tension of the room like a sharpened blade. She sounded utterly bored, casually mapping out my fate while undoubtedly seated in some luxury salon or high-end boutique. "Just make the old idiot sign the medical papers," Diane's recorded voice sneered with breathtaking cruelty. The venom in her tone was completely unrecognizable from the weeping innocent victim she had performed moments before. "Once we get him declared incompetent and lock him away in a nursing home, we get the 80%, and I never have to look at his ugly face again." The recording captured a short, dismissive laugh, a sound so utterly stripped of basic human empathy that it sent a cold shiver straight down my spine. Then the intercepted call cut off abruptly. The sharp digital click of the device going silent rang out in the quiet room. The devastating effect of her own words was immediate and total. The carefully assembled illusion of her innocence shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces right in front of the federal authorities. Diane froze completely where she knelt, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unfiltered shock. The manufactured theatrical tears on her pale cheeks vanished at once, displaced by the terrifying realization that she had just been publicly exposed as the true architect of my destruction. She had known everything from the very beginning. She had helped plan my total ruin with cold, methodical precision. She had genuinely wanted me locked inside a secure psychiatric facility, so she could freely spend the millions of dollars I had sacrificed my entire life to accumulate. The federal investigators exchanged grim, knowing glances with one another. They had dealt with many ruthless corporate conspirators, and Diane had just handed them absolute, undeniable proof of her full participation in a massive federal fraud. Rowan looked up at his wife from his humiliating position on the cold floor. He finally grasped that she had just driven her heel into his ribs and abandoned him to save herself, only to be immediately exposed as an equal partner in the very same crime. The mutual contempt radiating between the married couple was a truly pathetic thing to witness. I looked at the two of them, the greedy daughter and the arrogant son-in-law, utterly destroyed by their own relentless ambition and bottomless selfishness. The crushing weight of the last 5 years lifted completely from my tired shoulders. I was no longer a victim confined to their dark basement. I was the undisputed master of my own fate, once again holding every remaining card. I turned slightly and reached toward a silver tray resting on the polished mahogany table nearby. One of the fleeing tech investors had left behind a half-full crystal glass of vintage red wine. I picked up the heavy glass in my left hand. In my right, I held the gleaming titanium vault key, the single physical object standing between them and a maximum security federal prison. I slowly extended the metal key directly over the wide rim of the glass. Rowan gasped loudly, lurching his trembling hands forward in a desperate final attempt to stop me, but the armed agents forced him straight back down against the hard floor. Without breaking my cold, steady gaze, I opened my fingers. The custom-milled titanium key dropped heavily into the dark red wine with a soft splash, sinking straight to the bottom of the glass. Diane finally found her voice, releasing a sharp, hysterical scream of pure panic, but it was far too late for any apology. I drew my arm back and hurled the dark liquid directly into both of their terrified faces. The room watched in absolute stunned silence as the final act of vengeance concluded. "Happy birthday!" The dark red wine dripped slowly down Rowan's face, seeping into his crisp white shirt and running together with his tears. He let out a pathetic wail that sounded like a dying animal. The federal agents gave him not a single moment to wipe his eyes or gather himself. The lead agent stepped forward, boots hammering against the marble, and seized Rowan by the collar of his ruined custom tuxedo. With one swift practiced motion, the agent spun him around and drove him face first against the polished mahogany table where the fraudulent $15 million contracts still lay spread out. The sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tight around Rowan's wrists rang through the grand foyer. It was the sound of absolute finality. Rowan began to thrash violently against the heavy wooden table, screaming about his innocence, about terrible misunderstandings about his powerful attorneys. But his frantic words landed on completely deaf ears. Two large federal agents grabbed him by the arms and dragged his thrashing body backward across the floor. His expensive Italian shoes scraped loudly against the imported marble as they hauled him toward the massive front doors. He kicked and screamed, begging the remaining guests for help. But the wealthy elite simply turned their faces away in disgust. They shoved him out into the raging storm and pushed him roughly into the back of a waiting armored federal transport vehicle. As Rowan was taken away, another group of official-looking individuals came through the entrance. They were not federal agents. They were elite representatives from the Federal Banking Commission and the primary lending institutions, flanked by their own private security personnel. They moved with clinical efficiency, paying no attention whatsoever to the luxurious surroundings or the terrified socialites still frantically gathering their coats and scrambling for the exits. One senior bank representative walked straight to the main interior wall and pulled a thick roll of red federal seizure tape from his heavy briefcase. He began posting bright, prominent foreclosure notices aggressively across the beautiful hand-painted wallpaper and the massive marble pillars. The $15 million estate was no longer a monument to extraordinary wealth and elite social standing. It had become in an instant an active federal crime scene and a seized government asset. The sheer speed with which Rowan's entire fraudulent empire was being methodically dismantled was breathtaking to witness. Everything he had stolen, everything he had deceived and manipulated his way into possessing was being legally stripped from him within minutes. Diane simply stood frozen amid the chaotic flurry of federal activity. The dark red wine I had thrown in her face was still dripping from her chin, soaking into the delicate fabric of her custom designer birthday gown. She looked around the grand foyer with wide, completely vacant eyes, unable to absorb the total annihilation of her carefully curated reality. A female federal agent approached her with a stern, entirely uncompromising expression. "You need to vacate the premises immediately, ma'am," the agent said firmly, pointing directly toward the open front doors. "This entire property, including all physical contents, vehicles, and personal belongings inside, has been officially seized by the United States federal government pending a major criminal investigation. You are legally trespassing." Diane gasped, her hands flying to her stained chest in absolute horror. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, her voice fracturing with raw panic. "I live here. All of my clothes, my expensive jewelry, my life is in this house. You cannot just throw me out into the street. The federal agent didn't flinch or offer a single ounce of sympathy. You have 2 minutes to walk out that door voluntarily, the agent stated coldly, or you will be placed in handcuffs and physically removed for obstructing a federal seizure operation. Diane looked desperately toward me, her tear-filled eyes silently pleading for some miraculous last-minute rescue, but I simply turned my back on her and walked slowly toward the front entrance. I stepped out through the heavy oak doors, leaving the chaotic strobing lights of the grand foyer entirely behind me. The freezing rain was still falling in thick, relentless sheets. I walked down the stone steps and across the muddy driveway, making my way toward the midnight black Rolls-Royce Ghost, where Elliot Voss was already waiting. I climbed into the warm, luxurious cabin and settled deeply into the pristine leather seat. A few moments later, I looked out through the rain-streaked tinted window. 2 federal agents had taken my daughter firmly by the arms and marched her out of the estate. They pushed her down the wet stone steps and left her standing alone in the wide circular driveway. She had nothing on but her thin, soaking birthday dress. The freezing rain matted her hair flat against her face and stripped away every trace of her expensive makeup. She wrapped her bare arms tightly around her shivering frame, completely surrounded by crushed flowers, deep mud, and the hard, terrifying pulse of police lights. She was standing in the precise spot where she had hurled me away like garbage just 1 hour before. The poetic justice of that moment was entirely undeniable. She looked utterly wretched, shaking violently in the brutal cold, finally enduring the same harsh, unforgiving reality she had so carelessly inflicted on her own father. She lifted her eyes slowly through the driving rain and found mine through the thick tinted glass of the vehicle. She opened her mouth, crying out my name, begging for one last chance at forgiveness. But the time for hollow lies and manufactured tears was completely finished. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or regret. I calmly raised my right hand and pressed the silver button on the door panel. The thick glass window rolled all the way up, silencing her desperate voice forever. As the massive midnight black Rolls-Royce Ghost pulled away from the heavily guarded crime scene, I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and closed my tired eyes. The relentless rain that had punished the city all evening was finally beginning to ease, softening into a gentle drizzle against the thick windshield. I listened to the smooth, quiet hum of the powerful engine and felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace settle into my weary, aging bones. Elliot Voss sat quietly across from me, giving me the time and space I needed to absorb the full magnitude of what had unfolded that night. I slowly opened my eyes and looked out the side window one final time. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers faded into the dark, winding roads of the exclusive River Oaks Hills. I was leaving that $15 million estate and the deeply toxic people inside it firmly in the rearview mirror of my life. I never looked back again, closing that dark chapter completely and forever. The aftermath of that explosive night was swift and brutally thorough. Federal authorities dismantled Rowan Halcott's fraudulent real estate empire with surgical precision. Because I had successfully delivered the original trust document along with the intercepted audio recordings, the prosecutors were working from an absolutely airtight case. Rowan pleaded guilty to multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud and international money laundering, desperately hoping to shave time off his lengthy sentence. But the federal judge extended him absolutely no mercy. He was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security prison, stripped entirely of his expensive custom suits and his arrogant swagger. As for the dangerous Russian syndicate, he owed $10 million. The federal seizure of his assets cut off any possibility of repayment. He is currently sitting in a small concrete cell, constantly looking over his shoulder, dreading the specific day he eventually walks free. My daughter Diane walked away from the wreckage with absolutely nothing to her name. Because the federal government permanently seized every asset purchased with stolen corporate funds, she was evicted and compelled to surrender her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, and her extravagant jewelry. She attempted to reach out to me repeatedly during the lengthy legal proceedings, sending long, tearful letters begging for financial support and a safe place to stay. I returned every single letter unopened. She had deliberately made her bed of lies and cruelty, and now she was left to sleep in it alone. I had spent my entire adult life trying to purchase her love and shelter her from the harshness of the world. But I finally understood that the best thing I could possibly do for her was to allow her to face the full unforgiving weight of her own selfish choices. I made no attempt to salvage Rowan's thoroughly corrupted company. The poisoned foundation it had been built upon was too deeply compromised to save. I allowed the federal courts to liquidate the massive real estate empire and let the fraudulent enterprise burn entirely to the ground. Before the total collapse of the corporate structure, however, Elliot Voss and his team of Wall Street attorneys moved quickly to represent my specific legal interests. Because I was the legally documented defrauded primary equity holder, Vanguard Holdings successfully negotiated the clean recovery of my initial investment capital before the massive federal asset forfeiture was fully finalized. The final financial settlement was an extraordinary, entirely unexpected blessing. I did not simply recover my original $500 to $5,000 through the careful legal liquidation of the clean corporate assets. I walked away with my full initial investment plus compounded market interest, totaling exactly $5 million in cash. It was a staggering sum, far more wealth than a retired mechanic from Cleveland could ever reasonably spend in one quiet lifetime. But I absolutely did not keep it to fund a lavish or extravagant way of living. I had witnessed firsthand what obsessive greed and unchecked luxury could do to a fragile human soul, and I flatly refused to let that dark poison contaminate the final, peaceful years of my life. Instead, I returned to my quiet hometown and used the money to establish a large philanthropic foundation. I created a specialized grant program dedicated entirely to supporting struggling, hard-working blue-collar mechanics. We provide critical financial assistance to older tradesmen burdened by overwhelming medical bills. And that is where the road finally ended for Gerald Whitmore. Not in that dark basement, not in the freezing mud of that driveway, and not in the silence of a daughter who stopped seeing him as a father long before that night. I have thought about everything this cost many times since then. It cost me years I cannot get back. It cost me a version of my daughter I used to believe in. But what it gave me was something I had not felt in a long time, the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I had not abandoned myself. I believe God does not waste our suffering. The Lord's timing is not always the timing we would choose, but it is always exactly what the moment requires. If you take anything from Gerald's story, whether you are walking through something like this now, or just trying to make sense of the world, let it be this. Never sign what you have not read, no matter who is asking, and no matter how much you trust them. If someone works to isolate you from your own resources, that is not love, that is control. Recognize it early. Keep the proof. Whatever the truth is, find a way to hold on to the physical evidence of it, because words alone will not protect you. And no matter how much you have given to someone, you cannot force them to value it. You can only decide what you will do next. This is the kind of adult-touched 50-plus family revenge story that reminds us all that life can take hard turns at any age, and that it is never too late to stand up for what is rightfully yours. If this story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share it with someone who might need the reminder that dignity is worth fighting for. And if you have not yet subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, I would be honored to have you stay. Thank you for being here with me today. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story.